modern perspective. And again, it was sort of a pre-echo, and some people would date the beginning of the earliest beginnings of modernism to about 2,000 years ago because of that, expressly because of that. But by about the year 400, most of the thinkers who could be classified as representative of a modern perspective just weren't around anymore, and the Dark Ages, the Middle Ages, it wasn't until the Renaissance that those values again emerged. Other questions, comments? Yes?
When you said that all perspectives have some truth in it, when I look at the excess pathology, some of those words, when I see them, eliminates the possibility for a perspective with some value. It's confusing.
The question is about looking at excesses and noting that it may be awfully hard to find some truth or value when you look at the excesses. I think what I would say to that is that every perspective has its extremes. Every perspective has folks who will carry it to an extreme, but that doesn't make it necessarily typical or representative of the perspective itself. I guess let me ask you this way: when you look at some of the innovations and enduring values, are those things that you can celebrate? Can you find truth in those? The traditional perspective, for example, the idea of law and order. We all want to live in an orderly society, presumably. Can you find value in those? And I think what I'm saying is we don't want to embrace the excesses and the pathological expressions of a perspective. We want to be able to throw those out and retain the truth in the perspective. That would be the spirit and basis of integral theory. Other questions, comments? Yes?
I really feel like Carl Sagan is like, I don't know, I don't think he belongs there.
You don't think Carl Sagan belongs as an exemplar of modern perspective? Where would you put Carl Sagan?
Postmodern.
Postmodern, okay. Why would you put him postmodern?
Have you ever seen Outlaw?
Okay, well,
I'm sorry.
actually, you're raising a good point. Yes, Julie.
I put him in postmodern because of the new spirituality.
Aha, okay. On the other hand,
I heard it.
okay. Yes, Rolf.
I'd like to nominate Richard Feynman for the modern example.
Aha, okay, we've got a nomination of Richard Feynman. Now, first, we're gonna move Carl Sagan over to postmodern. All those in favor, say aye and raise your hand. All opposed? Wow, that looks like consensus. So we moved Carl Sagan over to postmodern. Now, Richard Feynman. Richard Feynman.
Yeah.
The physicist.
Yeah.
Okay. How many here know Richard Feynman? Okay, those who know Richard Feynman, where would you put him? He's certainly known for his work in extremely modern physics, all kinds of modern science. I don't know him for anything that I could tag as postmodern or traditional.
Me neither.
Okay.
But he wasn't traditional. I mean, he thought outside the box. I mean,
right.
He rejected previous conclusions for sure, but he wasn't Carl Sagan. He
wasn't Carl Sagan. Okay. All right. So we've got Richard Feynman at least nominated for here. But now that we've talked about individual people, and we'll come back to this in just a minute, actually, it's really important to note that what we're classifying here is not people. And that's crucial. We're not classifying people, we're classifying perspectives. That is absolutely crucial. Almost everybody in this room, if not everybody in this room, I'll bet if you think for a little while, or maybe as we were going through these, you could identify with all three in parts of your life. But we'll come back to that in a moment. Any other comments or questions before we go on here? I still have a little bit more to say about the three perspectives. Yes?
Earlier, it sounded like you were kind of saying about this
how what? How polarized we're getting as a result of the culture wars.
So, is that
Okay. Am I saying that there is a traditional group and a postmodern group and a modern group? I'm not. In fact, I want to be very careful not to imply that we can group people into those areas. People that we don't know personally, we're likely to be able to slot, as these folks, we're likely to be able to slot because they're identified with some kind of stance or field of endeavor that can be classified as representative of a perspective. But I want to be very careful to say that we can't group people by these. Every one of us probably expresses each of these three perspectives in various parts of our lives. In fact, we'll come to that. Yeah, let's get more specific about that in a moment. First, I want to talk about the rallying cry of each of the three. If there were a rallying cry for tradition, it would be truth, meaning absolute truth, truth coming from a hierarchical authority, but truth is what we're after. Modern perspective would say our value is reason. Everything should be subject to reason. And postmodern says compassion. All three we can probably celebrate. Truth, reason, and compassion. And all three we can probably use as levers for finding truth in every stance. Now, some interesting estimates. American population. These are very subject to debate and discussion, and of course there's no way to get at them very clearly, but I've seen quite a few estimates of how these worldviews split in the U.S. population. And I think it's somewhere around 40% of people who sort of, their center of gravity is in a traditional perspective. But again, now here, Rob, this is an answer to your question in particular. We are not classifying people, we're classifying perspectives. If you think about these 6 areas of your own life, you might be able to detect that in some of those areas, you tend to emphasize one perspective over another. Have you ever heard someone talk about, or maybe you've had the experience, they live at a distance from family, go home for the holidays, come back, and talk about what a miserable time they had because they were instantly sort of in another mind space. And it might be simply identifying with the homestead, the family setting, associations, but also there's a piece of when you're thinking about home and family and childhood, you may be thinking from whatever perspective was dominant in your own family of origin, where you grew up. In other areas of your life, the workplace, it's not at all uncommon to find someone who socially and politically seems to be expressing predominantly traditional views. But in the workplace is thoroughly modern, and they fit in just fine, and have no problem adopting a modern perspective when it comes to employment and business and livelihood. Does that make sense? So we're classifying perspectives, not people. But again, the estimate is that about 25% of the American population predominantly expresses a modern perspective. And postmodern about 15%. Now here's a really interesting twist. Estimates of the wealth and power in the West in general, and the United States in particular. While the traditional perspective may account for 40% of the population, the estimates are that perspective isn't as dominant in public affairs and in education, is less highly educated.